Brilliant. Yes, as mentioned, I'm actually at the University of Sheffield. I'm in the English department, English literature, so I'm coming at everything from a slightly different angle today, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about my research and some of the projects that I've got going in Sheffield at the moment. I am looking at the representation of coma and coma survivors in literature, but that has kind of led on to looking at the representation of brain injury also. The nature of my PhD that I'm doing is quite interdisciplinary. So whilst it is in the English department, I'm also looking at social sciences and science itself. What led me to this was looking at the wealth of texts, films, TV programs, novels, plays, poetry that actually represents coma in some way, and brain injury as well. It also, I have a friend who's recently published his first novel, in which one of his characters is going through a rehabilitation process after coma, and what he was really interested in was looking at the ethics of research. So he actually interviewed somebody who was in quite a severe motorcycle accident, and he was really interested in looking and kind of representing the facts, whereas in a lot of the literature and a lot of the television and film, what I've started to find is that there is non-factual representations and quite a lot of misleading information, which is what I want to be talking about today. I also see this idea of branching out into kind of public engagement as being the future of arts and humanities, really, when there's huge question marks over government cuts and the rise in tutor fees and maybe putting people off from taking an arts degree. I think that the real future of it is to have public engagement and working out in the communities, and that's what I've also been doing, which I will talk about towards the end of this talk. So what I've actually noticed is that whilst there's a lot of texts about coma and brain injury, there's very little first-person writing, people who have experienced it firsthand. And there's certainly very little fictional writing by people who have experienced coma and brain injury. What I'm interested in is perhaps this is leading to a collective mythology amongst an audience and readership, so that people think that they know what brain injury is and coma. But in actual fact, the information that they're getting is misleading because of misleading representations and false representations in the media and in literature. And I think this also coincides with a certain stigmatizing of these conditions as well within society, and a lack of full understanding. And I'm very interested about how that balance can be redressed. So the first thing I want to kind of look at is this idea of using insensitive metaphor in social and political language. And you see this all the time. You see politicians talk about political debacles as being car crashes without necessarily thinking about the emotive content of that phrase for people who've actually been involved in accidents. At least twice over the last 2 or 3 months, there have been references to brain injury, but using brain injury as an insult, as an artistic slight, as an artistic insult. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with this quote that occurred probably about 2 months ago now on a BBC Two arts documentary about the history of the novel. This was, "People ask me if I ever thought of writing a children's book. I say, if I had a serious brain injury, I might well write a children's book." And this was from the elusive author Martin Amis. Also on BBC Two's review show about a month ago, when talking about the new Channel 4 series Camelot, that some of you might have seen, a leading cultural commentator said of the author that he must have had a brain injury to have written something so bad. Now, in the first instance, what I'm really interested in is the backlash that this caused. Yes, there was a lot of backlash, but the complaints weren't necessarily about the idea of the brain injury being used as an insult. It was the fact that the children's authors felt insulted that they'd been compared with somebody with a brain injury, which again is quite a shocking thing. And you can see this on the Guardian website, on the forums. The majority of criticism is about that. When looking into this, we also see cheap, cliched representations of brain injury and coma. For example, I'm sure we've all seen the examples of a character, usually in soap operas, who receives a blow to the head. They then have amnesia, and they receive a second blow to the head, and everything comes flooding back. And it's these kind of cheap, cliched representations that create these misleading representations. There's an interesting study by 2 American neuroscientists, Eelco and Cohen Weidix, when looking at the portrayal of coma in contemporary motion pictures. They looked at 30 movies from 1970 to 2004. 22 key scenes from 17 movies were rated for accuracy by a panel of neurointensivists and neuroscience nurses, and then were shown to 72 non-medical viewers. And the accuracy of the scenes were assessed using a Likert scale, and the results are really interesting. Coma was most often caused by motor vehicle accidents or violence. It's about 63%. The time in a comatose state varied from days to 10 years. Actors personified the sleeping beauty with eyes closed, beautifully groomed. Physicians appeared as caricatures. Only 2 movies had a reasonable, accurate representation, and that was Dream Life of Angels and Reversal of Fortune. The majority of the surveyed viewers identified inaccuracy of representation of coma awakenings and conversations on the experience of being in a coma, except in 8 of the 22 scenes, which is about 36%, a very low figure. And 28 of the 72 viewers, about 39%, could potentially allow these scenes to influence decisions in real life. And we also find this idea that awakening occurred in 18 of the 30 films, which is about 60%. And awakening was sudden, with cognition intact, even after prolonged time in coma. And I think this representation is very common in television, in film, in literature. And what I'd like to look at next is to look at some representations in literature that are starkly contrasting. Very often when you speak to people about what they understand coma to be about, they seem to equate it with quite complex dreamscapes and see it as a sleep state. And in a lot of the texts that I've been studying, this is very similar. So we have, for example, Alex Garland, again an eminent novelist and screenwriter, and his novel The Coma. This focuses on a protagonist called Carl, who's plunged into coma after a violent attack, after an attack on a tube train. First, he has to confront the fact that he is in a coma, because he has this memory of awakening from coma and living a life. But what he actually realizes is this is a coma dream, if you like. So he has to try and battle to try and get back to the waking world, as he calls it. So if we just look at this extract, this is at a point when the character of Carl realizes that he can move between his conscious states. And now that I knew I was dreaming, had become self-aware, the place I was seeing was a sense of place. While I could sense it, I could see it. And if, as I shifted from one location to another, I could sense 2 places, if I could sense a bedroom and open curtains, but also sense a record shop with strip lighting and shelves stacked with LPs, alphabeticized, then for a moment curtains would blow open over the window of the record shop and the vase of flowers would stand on the record shop counter. Now again, this extract seems to be more concerned with dreamscapes than actually looking at the nature of coma and the nature of rehabilitation. Within it, Garland's character can move between these conscious states and can make himself move between these states. And actually when we look at Garland interviewed about the novel in The Guardian in 2004, he actually says, "I spent a lot of time wondering why dreams are so tricky in a narrative. There was something rather naff about talking about dreams. This in itself is something that pushed a button in me because it felt like a taboo or something." So again here, there's no mention of actually writing about coma. He's writing about dreamscapes. And it's interesting, in some of the workshops that I've been running with people who haven't experienced coma and brain injury, reading the novel, they seem to think that these are accurate representations of the coma state. And again, I think this is down towards this collective mythology that is being propagated. If we look at someone like Irvin Welsh as well in his novel Marabou Stork Nightmares, similarly his character can move between levels of conscious states within the coma. And this character's been in coma for 3 years. And again, there was no mention of any kind of ongoing brain injury afterwards. It's never mentioned. And again, it creates these huge dreamscapes that are really coherent narratives that go from one point to the other. And a lot of the people who I've spoken to and who I've been working with who have experienced coma and brain injury, this hasn't been the case. Many people can't recollect anything within the coma. Some people can recollect little snapshots, but it's certainly not what these novels create, huge complex storylines. Again, in a novel, Ian Banks' is The Bridge. Within that, there's a fracturing of identity, and there's 3 complex storylines that run throughout the novel. In one of them, we follow a Scottish barbarian who's on a traditional quest narrative to rescue a captured princess, which becomes a metaphor for trying to escape from the coma state. And another one of the storylines, in the world of the bridge itself, the character John Orr is frequently confronting himself on a TV screen in his living room. He sees himself in an intensive care unit, which seems to be an image that is used wholesale in the series Life on Mars, if anybody saw that. It seems to have been taken wholesale from the novel The Bridge. So as mentioned, these depictions of complex and coherent linear narratives, if you like, in the literature doesn't really correlate with the experience of coma victims and brain injury victims. Many have no recollection of the coma itself. And neither is the fiction concerned with the physical consequences of coma or with brain injury as a whole. Indeed, they rarely entertain it as a possibility, particularly these what we call interior coma narratives, where you see the person experiencing coma. But I would argue as well that they don't really tell us much about dreams. These complex storylines. In all three novels, there are very complex historical biographies of the characters. And if we look at the French philosopher Maurice Halbwachs, he said this about dreams: we're incapable of reliving our past while we dream, and that if our dreams evoke images that have the appearance of memories, these images are introduced in a fragmented state. Only detached shreds of the scenes we have really experienced appear in dreams. There never appears in dreams an event accompanied by all its particularities, without a mixture of alien elements. There never appears in the eyes of sleeping consciousness a complete scene of events that occurred in the past. And again, many of these novels would contradict this. And again, I feel as though this is creating a mythology and misinformation within a general readership. However, there is an element of, I hesitate to call it well-researched texts, but there are certainly texts that do put in some research, that are concerned with rehabilitation processes, the struggles of coping with the coma and struggles of coping with brain injury. One such novel is a novel called Remainder by Tom Mccarthy, his debut novel. And you often find this in novels that are kind of post-trauma novels, novels post-coma. Within this novel, the unnamed narrator struggles with the rehabilitation process and struggles to come to terms with the person he was before the coma and afterwards. And in this section, he talks about how his movements don't feel fluid, or that his movements feel second-hand. And in this section, he talks about trying to relearn to walk again. He says, "Everything was like this. Everything, each movement. I had to learn them all. I had to understand how they work first, break them down into each constituent part, then execute them. Walking, for example. Now that's very complicated. There are 75 maneuvers involved in taking a single step forward, and each maneuver has its own command. I had to learn them all 75. And if you think, that's not so bad, we all have to learn to walk once, you just had to learn it twice, you're wrong. Completely wrong. That's just it, see. In the normal run of things, you never learn to walk like you learn swimming, French or tennis. You just do it without thinking how you do it. You stumble into it, literally. I had to take walking lessons. For 3 whole weeks, my physio wouldn't let me walk without his supervision in case I picked up bad habits, holding my head wrong, moving my foot before I bent my knee, who knows what else." We also find some research being put in quite a surprising area, in something like Stephen King's The Dead Zone. I'm not sure whether anyone's familiar with this novel of the 1970s. It was turned into quite a major film. Within this, whilst it has a fantastical narrative, an unbelievable narrative really, which is concerning the character of Johnny Smith, who after coming out of coma and after experiencing brain injury has psychic powers. He can see the future and he can read the past. What is interesting in such a pulp fiction novel is that King shows some awareness of research and some ethics of research, some interest in actually looking at the rehabilitation process. As we find in this section, Johnny's just awoken from the coma and the doctor's now talking to him about his physical rehabilitation. Again, over half the novel talks about the character's rehabilitation, which is interesting for a mainstream pulp novel. "The ligaments shorten," Weizsäcker said. "Yes, that's why comatose patients begin to pull into what we call the pre-fetal position. But we know more about the physical degeneration that occurs in coma than we used to. We are better at holding it off. You have been exercised regularly by the hospital physical therapist, even in your sleep. And different patients react to coma in different ways. Your deterioration has been quite slow, Johnny. As you say, your arms are remarkably responsive and able, but there has been deterioration. Your therapy will be long and painful. You will shed your tears. You may come to hate your therapist. You may come to fall in love with your bed. And there will be operations. Only one if you are very, very lucky, but perhaps as many as 4 to lengthen those ligaments. These operations are still new. They may succeed completely, partially, or not at all. And yet, as God wills it, I believe you will walk again. I don't believe you will ever ski or leap hurdles, but you may run, and you will certainly swim. So these last 2 extracts are what I've kind of alluded to in my talk as being faction, kind of a hybrid word really between fact and fiction. That these texts are putting in some element of research, but they're set against quite fantastical backdrops that aren't believable in themselves, but we know that they're not believable, which allows us to kind of tap into the actual research. But again, all of these extracts that I've been looking at prove this notion that there's very little first-person writing, very little at all. So again, does this help to try and extend the voicelessness of coma? Does it strip away agency from those who are truly affected by brain injury? And ultimately, does the lack of first-person testimony continue to propagate these mythologies around coma and brain injury, stigmatizing the conditions? Perhaps these authors are creating a genre of fictional science rather than science fiction. So this brings me on to The Right Way, which is a group that I've been running in Sheffield. Got a couple of the writers here today. There we go. To try and redress this balance, I've been running creative writing groups with a group of writers from Sheffield. And what we've been focusing on is to look at actually writing about experiences of both TBI and ABI and coma. We've been looking at kind of creative and non-fiction techniques, because inevitably non-fiction has some kind of creative process anyway. And we've been looking at different narrative structures and how they work. We've been looking at writing setting and how to create different settings. We've been looking at characterization. We've been looking at descriptive techniques and how to be able to voice these experiences. We've been looking at the effects and impacts of writing in different perspectives. So how might a reader be affected if you're writing in the first person? How might it be affected if you're writing in the third person, so on. The main focus has been, how do we narrativize ourselves? How do we put ourselves into stories? How do we put ourselves into the writing that we are creating? This has a particular resonance, of course, for the writers who are sometimes voicing experiences that they haven't previously been able to voice, or experiences that are particularly painful or particularly uplifting. Hugely important has been the focus on process, and not really necessarily focusing on an end result, because the process is the key way to try and develop a creative voice. So we've been looking at the value in fragments and notes and drafts and redrafts and developing work from there. There's the common phrase in the creative arts about finding one's voice. I think all of the writers have been going through that process, and they're still going through the process of finding the voice, the register in which they want to express their thoughts and their feelings and their stories ultimately. This has led to the publication later in this year of our first book, really, called Headlines. There's the front cover, again designed by one of the writers. The pieces within Headlines contrast really widely about various people's different experiences, different styles, which is what makes it so exciting. It's having its official launch at the Sheffield Off the Shelf Literary Festival in October. The event will be held at the university. My ultimate aim is to try and create a quarterly literary magazine and non-fiction magazine and artwork that can be published either online or, depending on budget, I'd quite like to create physical copies as well, whereby people nationally who've experienced coma and brain injury can actually write and submit work, and it can be published and released quarterly. What I'd actually like to end with, I mean, I will be around all day and tomorrow, so if anybody's interested, I've got mailing lists as well where I can kind of keep you updated in terms of the work, and if anybody's interested in submitting work, that would be fantastic. But I'd actually like to end fittingly, I think, with an extract from Headlines, the first public reading of a story by one of the writers who's here today, so that you can actually see the work that is being created. and the exciting work that is going on. This is a story by Steph, who's down here at the front. It's called Blue Polystyrene Shoes, and the purpose of this story was to look at cognitive confusion post-coma and the panic and the fear that that can induce. So I'd like to finish with the first public reading of this. Okay. The man opens his eyes. Is he waking up? He needs the toilet. Looks around the dark room, his eyes adjusting to the dark. 2 or 3 beds. Looks hospitalish in the dark. The man sits up in bed. He needs to go to the toilet. Something tight in his arm. His eyes have not adjusted to the dark yet. He doesn't know where he is. Needs the toilet. Stands up and starts to move away from the bed. A nurse-like figure comes to him out of the dark. His arm's even tighter now. It's holding him back and he needs to go to the toilet. He can see a tube running from the middle of his right arm, stretching back to the side of the bed. There are some hospitally things there. He yanks his arm. Ow. There's a little pain, but now he is free to go for a wee. He's busting. The nurse woman figure puts her hands on his arms and pushes him backwards. She's remonstrating, but he cannot understand any language. He says he wants to go to the toilet. Then nothing. Possibly the next day, the man opens his eyes again and his attention is drawn to the left side of his bed. At the fore, 3 old people, 2 men and a woman. The man in bed has no idea who these people are, but behind them is a pretty, younger woman. His eyes are drawn straight to her. He has no idea why. He does not know who these people are. All he knows is he feels a hell of a lot toward the young woman stood at the back crying and looking at the man in bed, and looking like she's being crowded out by the older people between her and the man in bed, as if she barely has a right to be there. The old woman says something to the man who cannot understand any language. He looks at the woman and says, "I love you." And he really means it. He really feels it from his bed. "I love you too," says the ugly old woman, coming even closer to the man's bedside. "Not you, you stupid old woman," says the man in bed. "The woman behind you." The woman behind, who is crying, makes eye contact with the man in bed and smiles the absolutely most glorious smile. The man in bed feels very good. He knows her, and he knows that she loves him. He cannot express it in words at this stage, but he has the feeling of love for her. It is mutual. Then nothing. The next thing, a man is walking out of hospital, possibly 5 weeks later. He isn't walking, not unaided. When he looks down at his clumsy feet, they seem to be wrapped in blue polystyrene bags instead of shoes. He has his right arm around the shoulders of the beautiful, crying, smiling woman, and has it left around the shoulders of a tall, handsome, blonde bloke, about the same age as the man himself, perhaps a few years older. The man in the blue polystyrene bags for shoes, he doesn't know any other way to identify himself, feels that there is a little energetic boy dancing about on the hospital furniture on the way to the exit. Then nothing. Who knows when later? A few hours, a few days, a week, 5 weeks. It matters not. The man who has a crying, smiling woman that loves him, and he, her, is sat in an armchair, apparently reading an edition of J.S. Mill's Utilitarianism. Nothing goes into his head out of the book, for the man is unable to understand written language, but he looks the part. When the other man on the arm of his chair praises the former for being able to understand such eloquent philosophy, the former takes it in his stride. There also seems to be a lovable little boy dancing and making his voice heard in the back of the room. The boy and the woman are connected, thinks the man, who had seemed to be involved in absorbing the heady philosophy of utilitarianism. Then nothing. The man woke up. He opened his eyes whilst lying flat on the bed beneath a quilt. He had the powerful, overwhelming feeling in his entire being that he had just woken up for the first time since... Who was he? He had feelings of panic because he did not know who he was. These feelings subsided to give way to a perhaps more pressing problem. Where was he? A prison cell, he answered to himself. The room he was in was small, like he imagined a prison cell to be, although he had no idea if he had ever been inside the prison cell before. He did not even know what country he was in. Pure panic. His chest heaved up and down quickly, panicking. He was only sure of one thing, that now, at this moment, he was finally properly conscious. aware of his surroundings. He needed to learn where he was, to ascertain his situation. He swung his legs out of bed so that he was sitting with his bare feet on the carpeted floor. He was naked, and there was a pile of clothes on the floor, which he took to be his. He was naked but for some sort of bandage which covered his left forearm and part of his hand and fingers. Looking around the small room, he considered that perhaps he was not in a prison cell. The floor was carpeted, the bedding pretty, and there was a desk and chair with a bookshelf above it. He was in some sort of cell, but surely not a prison cell. It was the strangest feeling, not knowing who or where he was. But he had his faculties now at last, he thought to himself. The man stood up so that he was looking down onto the top of the desk, which was strewn with books and many handwritten pages of someone who had evidently been busy. Eureka! The man recognized the writing. It was his own. Very excitedly, he tried to read what seemed to him he had written. Something was wrong. He could not comprehend the language there upon the handwritten pages. The style looked legible enough, even neat, and he could isolate words and know them, but for some panic-stricken reason he could not grasp anything of the meaning. There were hand-drawn images of the eye and the brain, and there were political, philosophical, sociological and psychological writings, all of them beyond the man's comprehension. Were these his works? Did the corresponding books on the shelf belong to him? Upon some of the pages he now noticed was the name S.D. Grant and the designation 118 Windsor Hall. What the hell was going on? Was he S.D. Grant? He did not recognise the name, only the handwriting. He dressed in the clothes that were on the floor by the bed he'd slept in. Luckily they fitted. Perhaps they were his own, even though he did not recognise them. Perhaps the door to his cell was locked and he would not be able to ascertain anything further than he had so far, which was zero, it seemed, other than that was his writing upon the pages on the desk. The man, very quietly, crept to the door of his cell, as if somebody might be able to see or hear him. Very gently, very silently, he pushed the handle down, ever so slowly. He surreptitiously pulled the door toward him. Yes, it was unlocked, and peered out onto the carpeted, short corridor beyond. Thank you. Cheers.
Okay, Matt, I think you've got us all thinking. Any questions? Keith?
I'll always ask a question, you know. You alluded to it at the beginning when you were talking about not so much in literature, but certainly in TV and movies.
Sure.
There's a kind of mythology. How much do you think that has really hindered people's perception of what happens after a brain injury? And I don't just mean because families and people in Headway are obviously clearly aware of it.
Yeah.
But the general public you would expect to be conned by this. But other people, like politicians, like Department of Health, you know, there's like people influential who can influence what happens. How much do you think that kind of mythology has kind of hampered our cause?
I would say quite a lot, because there does, I mean, for example, a lot of people that I'm talking with, I'm sure everybody can associate with this. For example, the assumption that people with brain injuries may be drunk, which comes very often, and that is again just about this misinformation and hampering the cause, because with other conditions you wouldn't necessarily jump to that conclusion very often, and I feel, and again with the political language that is being used, I mean, it's not so long ago that cancer was used as political metaphor, and now it seems to be brain injury, car crashes, this kind of language, and that works towards stigmatizing conditions and showing a lack of awareness within the general populace. And politicians aren't, well, they're certainly not addressing their insensitive language.
Okay. One there, in the middle.
You said that the comments on the Guardian Forum, for example, were quite negative.
Sure.
When you were talking about the children's authors, did you feel the need to log anything onto those forums yourself? Or?
I didn't log comments on there myself actually, because by the time, well, it was kind of a couple of months ago, there were certain comments that were in support of trying to kind of redress this notion of brain injuries being an insult, but quite overwhelmingly not really. And what I've been trying to do really is within this work itself to try and get this, to kind of speak through this work itself, I think, to try and redress that balance about what the illusion of people with brain injuries is really in society.
There were counter comments made on the Neurotrauma Network.
Right. Yeah.
Through LinkedIn about brain injury.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, in the Guardian newspaper itself, I mean, there was an article in the newspaper as well, and I think there was one comment talking about the use of the insult, but the rest were talking about the insults to children's authors.
Excuse me,
Yeah.
you mentioned something about head injury, and did you also realise that there's other things that can happen also with the head injury?
Yeah.
Like double vision.
Yeah.
Which is like one above the other.
Yeah.
And when you tilt your head, you get them diagonals.
Mm.
Those things don't go away.
No. Yeah. I mean, that's interesting in terms of the when I was looking into this, the very famous photographer Edward Muybridge, who did the photographs of the horses, and he proved that horses' 4 legs are off the ground at any one time. Before he was a photographer, well, he wasn't a photographer at all, he was a travelling salesman around America, and he experienced quite a severe brain injury in a coach accident, and after that he had the double vision, and from that point onwards that seemed to influence the double vision of the photography, how he used that. But again, within the literature about Muybridge, it seems to be taboo to mention the fact that he entered a coma and he experienced a brain injury. It seems to be a taboo topic.